Hello again. If you watched last week, my name is Brad. I get to fill in from time to time on Wednesday nights for Shay to teaching, and was able to do that last week, and I'm gonna be able to do it this week. But Shay will be back next week, so if you really miss him, next Wednesday you should see a video with him. But I get to continue today because well, we're in Second Corinthians, and last week we did chapter 8, meaning we're going to do chapter 9 this week. And chapter 8 and chapter 9 really go hand in hand. And so if you'll remember, we'll just do a quick review of last week. So back in First Corinthians chapter 16, the church in Corinth was presented with an opportunity to give to the church in Jerusalem and to do so to help with their various afflictions. Remember, we don't totally know what they were suffering with. We just know that they needed money. And Paul let the church in Corinth know about this in First Corinthians, and they were really eager to give. So, sometimes you hear those opportunities of a ministry or something to give to, and it just really gels with your spirit for whatever reason, and you really want to give. And that seems the way that the Corinthians were back in First Corinthians. But as you've come to learn throughout First and Second Corinthians, the church is spiritually pretty immature. And when you have an immature church, or just immature person in general, you'll find that they tend not to follow through with things. And so the church in Corinth, they were eager to give to Jerusalem. They said, yeah, we want to do it. But they ended up, not collecting the offering like Paul instructed them to back in First Corinthians chapter 16. And so Paul's writing to them, and in Second Corinthians chapter 8, he kind of lays out these reasons why they should be giving. And he starts by giving this example of the churches of Macedonia who had heard about the Corinthians' desire to give to Jerusalem, and they were so moved by this generous intention that they themselves were drawn to give. And that's just cool in its own right, but it's particularly noteworthy because the churches in Macedonia, remember we talked about like Philippi, Thessalonica, those churches were extremely poor. And they were so poor that Paul had seemingly told the churches, don't worry about giving. You're in a similar situation as the churches in Jerusalem. Why don't you just not give? You can pray for them, that kind of thing. But the text said that they begged for the favor of being able to give to the churches in Jerusalem. And so this really radical generosity where these people who don't have enough to give are just moved to give to the other Christians who need it. And one of the reasons they were moved was because of the churches in Corinth. And so Paul, knowing that Corinth has not taken up the offering, is writing back to them, and he says, hey, you encourage these other churches to give. You've said that you desire to give, so let's give. So I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to bring some people, some Macedonians with me, because they're so eager to see what you give. They're excited because they were excited enough to give, and now they want to see the collection happening too. And so he's sending various people to come and collect the money, and that's kind of where we're going to pick up. But before we get there, we'll quickly go over why Paul said last week that you should be giving, because he'll carry that into the first few verses today. And so he says, well, first of all, this is a grace from God. Remember, we often think about giving as a duty and maybe receiving as a grace. It feels really good. It feels like God's maybe watching out for you whenever you receive a gift from someone, but you don't feel like it's a grace to give. But Paul is saying, no, it's a grace because you're getting to share in the grace of Christ on the cross. So Christ gave. He is the truest and best picture of what sacrificial giving looks like. because he sacrificed his entire life. He, died and was buried, resurrected for your sins. That's sacrificial giving. You should give to be a part of that. And so he's saying, do that, but also give because you said that you were going to. You promised that you were going to give, and you need to, fulfill that promise. And this is a desire that you've had. It's not like I'm not coercing you into giving. You have this desire. And so again, the church is just spiritually mature, and they need to be moved in the right direction. And that's where we pick up in chapter 9. So we'll read the first 5 verses and then talk about it for just a little bit. Now it's superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I'm sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find out you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead and arrange in advance for the gift you've promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift and not an exaction. And so Paul is sending delegation ahead of himself to ensure that the gift that the church had promised to give would be ready. And he's doing this for a few reasons. It comes off like a mother before, company comes over and you have to give your kids the pep talk and say, I know you like to misbehave sometimes, but we have people coming over. We want to set a good example. Let's make sure that we're on our best behavior. And it's because, your kids are just immature and they just need a little bit of a pep talk from time to time. They need to be reminded of what's right and wrong. And so Paul is doing that in some ways. But he doesn't just do it to make them give. Remember, we talked last week a lot about how they're not interested in coercing people into giving, and he's continuing that here. He doesn't want to coerce them into giving if they don't want to. If he came with the Macedonians who are going to be accompanying him, and those people who were poor and gave, so sacrificially, were standing there watching you getting ready to give your gift, you'd be a lot more likely probably to give more than you really want to give. And that would be coerced giving. And so he says, I'm going to send people ahead. Make sure that you give to them if you do desire to give. Because then it can be truly out of like a pure motive and not just because you feel bad because these people who are poorer than you maybe gave more money than you, because that's coercion. But he's also doing it for the benefits of the Macedonians. He wants to ensure that they have a good impression whenever they arrive. And why? Does he care, I guess, that the Macedonians are so... think so highly of the church of Corinth? Well, it's because, again, they were poor and were drawn to give by a number of things, I'm sure, but in part by the Corinth promise of giving to the church in Jerusalem. And so you see this thing that like you're familiar with in everyday life where generosity brings about more generosity, right? It's the reason that when there's like a fundraiser at a church or business or whatever, they have those thermometers that show how much of our goal we've given, because the more that people give, the more you see that the goal is almost met and the more likely you are to give. Whereas if no one else is being generous, you're less likely to be drawn to be generous. And so the Macedonians were moved to give out of a promise of Corinth, and now Corinth are going to be moved and motivated by Macedonia, and all of them were motivated ultimately by the cross of Christ. And so when we think about the way that we should be motivated to give, we should see the cross and be inspired by that generosity to be generous ourselves. We should see the church in Corinth, or we should see the churches of Macedonia and be drawn to give, because, generosity brings about generosity. And so that's really where Paul's going to end this argument, which begins in chapter 8, verse 1, where he's kind of saying, these are the reasons why you need to give. And he's going to be moving into a section of saying there's just benefits to giving also. It's not just that you should be giving. Again, we don't want to coerce you, but there are real, tangible, meaningful benefits to giving. And that's where he'll pick up in verses 6 and 7. He says this: the point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he's decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And so Paul is doing something that I think a lot of us in the modern church are maybe uncomfortable with at times. And he's saying that, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. He's saying, there seems to be a real benefit to giving. And the reason that I think we're so uncomfortable with this is actually probably rooted in something good, which is there's a lot of people within the church who preach a false gospel of prosperity. And so what they're saying is, well, if you give to the church, if you're a good Christian, you'll be prosperous. You'll get a nice house. Maybe you'll get a nice car. Maybe the cancer you've just been diagnosed with will be healed. So health, wealth, prosperity is the way that it's often presented. And so that is a false gospel. We want to stay away from it, and that's good. But I think because of that, we'll read passages like this and get a little uncomfortable from time to time, because we know the prosperity gospel is not right, but there seems to be some benefit to giving, because those who sow sparingly will reap sparingly, and those who sow bountifully will reap bountifully. And so we need to try to understand what Paul is saying here. And so he gives this metaphor that the Corinthians be familiar with of sowing and reaping. You plant your seeds, and if you plant a lot of them, you do the hard work up front, you'll get a lot of fruit and veg. And if you don't, you won't. And so, you've all probably had gardens at some point in your lives. And, if you plant like a pot, you'll get some fruit and veg, and that's great. But if you plant an entire garden, like this huge area, if you're a farmer, obviously you'll reap more of the benefits. And so he's saying giving is the same way, but there's a catch, because we shouldn't give because we feel like we need to, or because we feel like we're going to receive something from it, but because we're drawn to give. We need to do it cheerfully and with a heart that yearns for giving. And so a cheerful heart is not one that gives because they think they're going to get something. That's a greedy heart, not a cheerful heart. And so you might say, well, like, how do I know if I'm being cheerful in my giving? And I'm sure there's a lot of ways, but a few that I thought of right off the bat were just, we know we're giving cheerfully when we do it quickly. I think we've all heard stories of someone who's suffering, and for whatever reason that really connected with us. Like maybe it was someone who had an illness that's affected us in some way, and they have a GoFundMe or something, and it's really easy sometimes to donate to some of those, and you do it cheerfully because you know what those people are going through. There's times when your heart just you just feel good about giving. Sometimes you just really want to give, and other times your heart's kind of like, I don't know if I want to. And so it's, if you're happy to give, then that's cheerful giving. I think when we don't pull back our wallet, so people will ask for money from time to time. I'm sure you've experienced this, and you really don't feel like giving it to them, and so you kind of withdraw yourself, pulling back the wallet when their hand is out, and sometimes maybe you'll push through and give them a few bucks anyway, and that's not cheerful giving, right? Cheerful giving is when their hand comes out, you're happy to give, you're giving quickly. And then the other is we don't give to get people's praise. And so there are people who I think give really publicly because they get a lot of praise from it, and that's a satisfaction that comes. But again, that's greedy giving and not cheerful giving. So just a few examples. I'm sure that there are more. And so again, taking a step back, well, why does Paul want them to give? He wants them to give because they said they would. They can share in Christ's giving, but not because he just needs their money, right? He wants them to give not just for the sake of giving, but because their hearts really and truly desire it. And so the phrase, like the Nike slogan, just do it, is perhaps applicable in some parts of our lives, but it's not applicable here, I think, because just do it is not a heart of cheerful giving. A heart of cheerful giving is saying, like, I want to do this. Please let me do this. It's not just get it done. All right, we'll move on to verses 8 through 15. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things and at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it's written, he's distributed freely, he's given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You'll be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of the service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession to the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others. While they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you, thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. And so this overflow and enrichment in verse 11, you'll be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God, should not be mistaken for prosperity gospel. This enrichment is not your pockets are going to become rich. God is enriching you for the express intent of giving, which leads to thankfulness of others towards him. So the enrichment cannot be motivated by self-interest. You'll be enriched because you are going to receive, and you'll receive more than you need. So God is gracious. He's giving to the church. Your needs are sufficiently met in such a way that it is now going to overflow to other believers. And what's going to happen to them is that they're going to start praising God. That's what the enrichment's for. It's not for you to have more stuff, right? It's for the glorification of God, for the spread of the gospel. And so God's not barely meeting the needs of his people, right? He's meeting their needs in a way that they can truly overflow and give sacrificially to other people. God's righteousness in verse 9, he says, and it's written, he's distributed freely, he's given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever, is speaking to his covenantal loyalty, his faithfulness. So he's not going to leave or forsake them, so they can be free to give out of an overflowing love of what God has given, and because he's faithful to the end. So this is the power of the gospel. God is faithful, and because of that, you can begin to give. The power of the gospel is uniting the Jews and the Gentiles. The Gentile believers are giving due to the overflowing of God's grace to Jewish Christians, who are in turn praying for the Gentiles. So it's uniting the Jews and the Gentiles through the gospel. And so Paul, at the end of this passage, is moved to thank God for this. He says, thanks be to God for this inexpressible gift. He's so moved and so touched by the power of the gospel to unite the people. And so for just a quick word of application, giving allows us to share in God's grace when it's done cheerfully and not out of selfish ambition. So give cheerfully. Look for the opportunities that your heart is truly drawn to give, and try to give in those situations. Our hope should be in the gospel for the edification of the church as a whole, and not as individuals concerned only with those around us. And so we should really truly be gospel-centered people. And so when we think about giving, well, why do we want to give? It's because it's edifying for the church, because it leads people to glorify God. And so we want to give there. And then finally, just give because Christ gave, and we get to share in that gift with him. So moving forward, look for opportunities to give, cheerfully, and try and do it with a heart that is thankful for who God is, and with a heart that's looking to spread the gospel.